I lived alone in a small rental house for about 2 years before this happened. The kind of place with a detached garage, a decent-sized yard, and neighbors close enough to see but far enough that you couldn't really hear anything happening inside someone else's house. I worked a fairly normal schedule, home most evenings by 6, and I want to walk through this night in as much detail as I can, because the timeline of it is the part that still makes my stomach drop every time I think it through. I got home around 6:15, same as most nights, made dinner, watched some TV, nothing unusual about the evening at all. Around 10, I went through my normal routine of checking that the doors were locked before heading to bed, front door, back door, both secure, exactly as they always were. I fell asleep sometime before 11, and I want to be clear that nothing about that entire evening gave me any reason to think anything was wrong. I woke up sometime after 2 a.m., not from any specific sound, more from a general sense of wrongness that I've had trouble fully describing to anyone since. A feeling that the air in the room had changed somehow, that I wasn't alone in the way I'd fallen asleep believing I was. I lay there for a while, completely still, listening, telling myself it was nothing until I heard it clearly. Breathing. Not my own. Coming from somewhere in my room, close enough that it wasn't ambiguous. Definitely inside the room with me. Definitely not from outside a window or through a wall. I want to describe exactly what I did next because I've thought about it so many times since. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my phone, sitting right there on my nightstand. I stayed completely still, eyes barely open, trying to figure out where in the room the sound was actually coming from. And after what felt like an impossibly long few minutes, I made out a shape, standing in the corner of my room near my closet, facing my bed, not moving, just standing there, watching, in a room I had locked myself into hours earlier. I don't know how long I lay there before I finally moved, slowly, reaching for my phone with as little motion as I could manage, and the second my hand touched it, the shape moved, fast, out of the corner and toward my bedroom door, gone into the hallway before I could get a clear look at anything beyond a general silhouette, taller than me, dressed in dark clothing. I called 911 immediately, staying in my room with the door braced, and stayed on the line until officers arrived within about 8 minutes, which felt considerably longer in the moment. When they searched the house, they found the back door unlocked, though I would have sworn on anything that I'd checked and locked it myself before bed, and no other sign of forced entry anywhere. No broken glass, no damaged frame, nothing that would explain how someone got in beyond that single unlocked door. Here's the detail that still doesn't sit right with me, even now. The officers found no other trace of anyone in the house. No footprints, despite it having rained earlier that evening, which should have left something on my hardwood floors if someone had actually walked from my room to that back door. No fingerprints anywhere near the door or the corner of my room where I'd seen the shape standing. Nothing on my home's exterior cameras, which covered both the front and back of the property, showing anyone approaching or leaving at any point that night. The responding officer, a woman who'd clearly handled plenty of these calls before, told me something that has stuck with me since, not as comfort exactly, more as a kind of professional honesty I wasn't expecting. She said in her experience, break-ins where the intruder gets in without any sign of forced entry and leaves without any trace at all usually mean one of two things. Either the person had a key or some other legitimate means of entry they didn't want to be caught using, which given my locked doors and never having given anyone a spare key, seemed unlikely. Or, and she said this part more carefully, sometimes people report experiences like mine that never get a satisfying physical explanation at all, and she'd stop trying to force one onto every case that came across her desk. I moved out of that house within 2 months, breaking my lease early, taking the financial hit without much hesitation. I never found out who or what was standing in that corner, or how they got in and out without leaving a single trace behind. I do know that in my new place, I've added deadbolts to every door, a full camera system covering every angle of the house, and I still, most nights, find myself waking up around 2 a.m. for no reason at all, lying still, listening, before I can convince myself to fall back asleep. I agreed to house sit for a coworker's family for a week while they were on vacation. A fairly large house in a nice, quiet neighborhood. Nothing about the arrangement seeming even slightly risky going in. I'd house sat for people before, knew the general routine, feed the cat, collect the mail, keep the lights on a normal schedule so the place didn't look obviously empty. My coworker gave me the code to their alarm system, showed me around briefly before they left, and told me the house had never had any issues in the 8 years they'd lived there. The first 4 nights were completely uneventful, exactly the boring house-sitting experience I'd expected. It was the 5th night that changed everything, and I want to walk through the timeline carefully because the order these things happened in matters to how unsettling the whole situation became. Around 11 p.m., already in bed in the guest room, I heard the distinct chime the alarm system made whenever a door or window opened. A specific 2-tone sound I'd already gotten used to over the previous 4 nights from checking it myself each evening. I checked my phone, which had the alarm app linked to it, and it showed the back door had been opened and closed again within about 3 seconds. Too fast for a person to reasonably walk through. More consistent with the door simply not latching properly and swinging slightly in the wind, which is what I told myself at the time. I got up, checked the back door, found it locked and secure, no obvious issue with the latch, and went back to bed, chalking the alert up to some kind of system glitch. About 40 minutes later, the same alert came through again, same door, same near-instant open and close. This time I didn't just check the door. I walked through the entire downstairs with the lights on, checking every window and door individually, finding everything secure, no sign of any actual breach anywhere. I went back upstairs, and this time, instead of going back to sleep, I sat up in bed watching the alarm app, waiting to see if it would trigger again. It did, close to 1 a.m., but this time it wasn't the back door. It was a motion sensor in the hallway directly outside the guest room I was staying in. A sensor that, according to the app's activity log, had never once triggered during any of my previous 4 nights there, meaning something had moved through that specific hallway space closely enough to set it off. I stayed frozen in bed, listening, and heard, faintly, floorboards creaking in that same hallway, slow, deliberate steps moving past my door and continuing toward the far end of the hall where the primary bedroom was located. I called 911 immediately, keeping my voice as quiet as I could while explaining the situation, and stayed on the line, door locked, furniture pushed against it as an extra barrier, until police arrived roughly 10 minutes later. The search turned up nothing. No intruder found anywhere in the house. No sign of forced entry at any door or window. No explanation for the motion sensor's trigger beyond what the responding officer suggested might have been a temperature fluctuation or a pet moving through. Except the family's cat, I pointed out, had been sleeping in the guest room with me the entire time, which the officer acknowledged made that particular explanation less likely, though he didn't have anything better to offer instead. I called my coworker the next morning to let them know what happened, expecting them to be alarmed, and instead there was a long pause on the line before she said something I hadn't expected at all. She told me, somewhat reluctantly, that this had actually happened to her and her husband a handful of times over their 8 years in the house. Always the same pattern, an alert on the back door that resolved too fast to be an actual person, followed later by the hallway motion sensor triggering with no one visible, and that they'd simply learned to live with it over the years, telling themselves it was some kind of persistent electrical quirk in an older system that they'd never gotten around to fully diagnosing or replacing. She admitted, though, that she'd never actually heard footsteps herself, only ever the alerts, and that hearing I'd actually heard something moving through that hallway had unsettled her more than she expected it to, given how long she'd lived there without incident beyond the alarm triggers themselves. I finished out the week, sleeping far less than I would have liked, keeping every light in the house on for the remainder of my stay, and the pattern never repeated again during those final 2 nights. I never told my coworker I wouldn't house sit for them again, but I also never offered, and she never asked. I still don't know what walked that hallway that night, or why it seemed to specifically wait until I was the one staying there to finally make itself heard clearly enough that even a full police search couldn't explain it away. This happened while I was living alone in a small apartment on the 2nd floor of a converted house, split into 3 separate units, mine at the top of an exterior staircase that was the only way to reach my front door. I want to be upfront that I was always fairly careful about security, deadbolt, chain lock, blinds closed at night, the kind of habits you build up living alone in a city for a while. That carefulness is part of what made this situation so hard for me to make sense of afterward. It started small, easy to dismiss individually, which I think is exactly why it took me as long as it did to realize something was actually wrong. I came home one evening and noticed a book on my coffee table had been moved. Not missing, just shifted a few inches from where I distinctly remembered leaving it that morning. I told myself I'd simply misremembered, that it wasn't worth worrying about, and moved on with my evening. A few days later, it was a kitchen cabinet left slightly ajar that I was certain I'd closed. Then a lamp in my bedroom turned to face a different direction than I'd left it. Each individual instance was small enough to explain away, but the pattern, once I actually started paying attention to it, was unmistakable. Someone was getting into my apartment, moving small things, and leaving without taking anything or causing any obvious damage, which somehow felt worse than an actual robbery would have, because it meant whoever was doing this wanted something other than my belongings. The night everything changed, I came home to find a note sitting directly in the center of my kitchen table, folded once, my first name written on the outside in handwriting I didn't recognize. I want to describe exactly what it said, because I've never been able to fully shake the specific wording. It read, simply, "I like how you keep things. Please don't change the locks." Nothing else. No signature, no further explanation. I called the police immediately, and they came out, documented everything, dusted for prints on the note and around the areas I'd noticed things moved, and found nothing usable, no prints at all on a note that should have had at least my own from picking it up, let alone whoever had written it and left it there. They checked my locks, found no sign of tampering or forced entry anywhere, and the responding officer told me, honestly, that without physical evidence of a break-in, there wasn't much more they could actively investigate beyond filing the report and advising me to change my locks anyway, note or no note. I did change them, immediately, the very next day, against the note's explicit request, which felt like the only reasonable response to something that unsettling. For about 2 weeks afterward, nothing happened, no moved items, no further notes, and I genuinely started to believe whatever this had been was over, deterred by the new locks. Then I came home one evening to find another note, same handwriting, same location on my kitchen table, despite my apartment being locked, despite the new deadbolt showing no sign of forced entry, despite me being genuinely careful, by this point, to always lock up properly every single time I left. This note said something that has stayed with me far more than the first one. It said, "The locks don't matter to me." I was never using the door. I moved out within the week, breaking my lease and eating the financial loss without any hesitation. I never found out who had been getting in, or what they meant by not needing the door, whether that was some kind of psychological manipulation meant to frighten me further, or whether it was pointing at something about that specific apartment I never discovered, some other access point I simply never found during my own increasingly frantic searches of every wall, vent, and window before I finally left. I heard, through the building's landlord when I gave my notice, that the tenant before me in that same unit had also left somewhat abruptly, before their lease was up, and that he'd offered no real explanation beyond saying the apartment, quote, wasn't private the way it should be. The landlord had assumed at the time it was some kind of noise complaint about neighbors he hadn't wanted to elaborate on. Knowing what I know now, I'm not so sure that's what he actually meant at all. I still don't know what that apartment's actual access point was. The one that made a deadbolt and a locked door completely irrelevant to whoever was getting in. I've been careful never to fully explain that story to anyone who might live there next. Mostly because I genuinely don't know what I'd even tell them to actually watch out for. Beyond the general, useless advice to trust a feeling that something in your own home isn't quite as private as it should be. My family took a 2-week vacation a few summers ago. The first real extended trip we'd taken in years, leaving our house completely empty with a neighbor just checking on it periodically to grab mail and make sure nothing looked obviously wrong from the outside. We came home late on a Sunday night, tired from travel, not expecting anything except to unpack and collapse into our own beds after 2 weeks away. What we found instead is something my family still doesn't fully talk about together, even now. Everything looked completely normal walking in the front door. Nothing obviously disturbed, no sign of forced entry anywhere, exactly what you'd hope to find after leaving a house empty for 2 weeks. It was my youngest sister, going up to her room first while the rest of us were still unloading bags from the car, who called out that something was wrong, in a voice that had all of us running upstairs within seconds. Her room, which she'd left reasonably tidy before we left, was completely rearranged. Not messy or ransacked the way you'd expect from a typical break-in or robbery, but deliberately, carefully rearranged, Every piece of furniture shifted to a different position. Her bed moved to the opposite wall. Her desk relocated to where her bed used to be. Even smaller items like books and picture frames placed in specific, obviously intentional new spots rather than simply knocked around or disturbed at random. Nothing was missing. We checked immediately, and every single item she owned, jewelry, electronics, anything of actual value, was accounted for, just relocated within the room itself. My parents called the police immediately, and while we waited, we checked the rest of the house together, finding every other room exactly as we'd left it, completely untouched, only my sister's room affected at all. The responding officers were as confused as we were. No sign of forced entry anywhere on the property, no broken windows, no damaged door frames or locks, nothing on the exterior indicating how anyone could have gotten inside a fully locked house for what would have needed to be a substantial amount of time to rearrange an entire room this thoroughly and precisely. Our home didn't have a security camera system at the time, which in hindsight feels like an obvious oversight. But back then, it simply hadn't occurred to us as a priority for a quiet suburban house in a safe neighborhood. What genuinely disturbed all of us, beyond the simple fact of an intrusion, was how deliberate the rearrangement felt once we actually sat with it. My sister pointed out, once she'd calmed down enough to look at it more analytically, that the new layout wasn't random at all. It matched, almost exactly, the layout of her room from several years earlier, before we'd done a renovation that changed the room's dimensions slightly and required everything to be repositioned. Whoever had done this hadn't just moved her furniture around arbitrarily. They'd recreated a specific past version of that exact room, a version that predated any photos or records that would have been easily accessible to a random stranger who'd simply broken in looking for valuables. We asked our neighbor, who'd been checking the house periodically while we were away, if she'd noticed anything unusual. She said she'd been inside twice during our trip, both times finding everything completely normal, and specifically remembered nothing unusual on what she believed was her final check, only 4 days before we returned home, meaning whatever happened had occurred sometime in that final short window, without triggering any alert from her, without any sign of a break-in that she or later the police could identify. My family installed a full security system within the week, and we never determined who or what had been inside our house, or how they knew the specific previous layout of a room that had been changed years before, in a way that would have required either detailed personal knowledge of our family's history or some other means of understanding that room's past we've never been able to explain. My sister slept in our parents' room for the following several months, unable to feel comfortable back in her own space, despite everything being eventually returned to its normal, current arrangement. Even now, years later, and having long since moved out of that house, she's mentioned to me more than once that she still occasionally checks her current apartment's layout against a mental photograph of how she left it, a habit she says she picked up that year and has never quite been able to let go of since.